My sister announced she was pregnant for the 8th time. I was so fed up with raising her kids for her that I left. But she called the police to arrest me. And this is what happened. My name is Jasmine, and I am 32 years old. I am a nurse practitioner, and I have spent my entire adult life being the safety net for people who refuse to help themselves. 2 days ago, I found myself sitting in the back of a squad car with cold metal handcuffs biting into my wrists. Through the reinforced glass, I watched my younger sister, Tanisha, screaming at the officers, claiming I was a monster who had abandoned helpless children. But the only thing I abandoned was the delusion that I could save people who were determined to drown. Before I tell you how I managed to turn the tables and why my brother-in-law is now facing federal charges, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe. If you have ever been the black sheep just because you refuse to be the family bank account, let me know in the comments below. This nightmare began exactly 48 hours prior, at what was supposed to be a traditional Sunday dinner at my mother Mama Joyce's house. Growing up, Sunday dinner was sacred, but lately it had become a circus of neglect. As soon as I walked through the door, the smell of burnt macaroni and dirty diapers hit me. The house was vibrating with noise. Tanisha has 7 children ranging from 1 to 10 years old, and they were tearing the living room apart. Cushions were thrown everywhere and juice was spilled on the carpet. In the center of this hurricane sat Brad, my sister's husband. He is a 35-year-old white man who describes himself as a conceptual artist. Yet in 8 years of marriage, he has never sold a single piece of work. He was sprawled out on my mother's recliner wearing noise-canceling headphones and playing a game on his phone, completely ignoring his 3-year-old daughter, who was crying at his feet. I took a deep breath and walked to the kitchen to help my mother, but Tanisha stopped everyone. She stood at the head of the table wearing a brand-new designer dress that I knew she could not afford. She tapped her fork against her glass, demanding silence. "Everyone listen up," she said with a smug smile that made my skin crawl. "The Lord has decided to bless this family again. Brad and I are pregnant with baby number 8. My mother threw her hands in the air, shouting praises to God. Brad did not even look up from his phone, he just gave a lazy thumbs up. I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked over at Marcus, the oldest nephew. He is 10 years old, and was wearing a winter coat inside the house because he was ashamed of his torn t-shirt. He did not look happy about another sibling. He looked hungry and tired. That was the moment something inside me finally snapped. I looked at Tanisha and realized this was not a blessing. This was a hostage situation, and I was the one paying the ransom. Tanisha cleared her throat and smiled that saccharine smile she uses whenever she wants something expensive. "So Jasmine, since this pregnancy is considered high risk due to my stress levels, I have decided to deliver at the Cedars-Sinai private maternity wing. The deposit is $15,000 and they need the wire transfer by Tuesday morning. I already put your contact information down as the primary billing party." She did not ask me, she informed me. Before I could even process the audacity of demanding a luxury berth while unemployed, Brad chimed in with his mouth full of cornbread. "Yeah, and Jazz, with the new baby coming, the noise level here is killing my creative process. I need a sanctuary. We were thinking I could move my studio into your climate-controlled garage. You are barely using it anyway since you park in the driveway. Just give me the code and I will move my stuff in on Monday." My mother, Mama Joyce, clasped her hands together, beaming at them. "That sounds like a wonderful plan. Jasmine has so much extra space in that penthouse, it is sinful to keep it to herself. Family helps family, right, baby?" The room fell silent, waiting for my usual submission. In that silence, my mind began to replay every receipt I had collected over the last decade. The $3,000 I paid for Tanisha's car transmission so she could drive the kids to school, only to find out she was driving them to the mall. The $2,000 for Brad's bail when he got caught shoplifting art supplies. The countless tuition checks, grocery runs, and utility bills. I looked at the 7 children squeezed around the table wearing clothes I bought, eating food I paid for, and I realized that my generosity had not helped them. It had crippled them. I carefully placed my fork down on the china plate. The clink echoed like a gavel striking a judge's bench. No. I said the word softly, but it carried the weight of 10 years of resentment. Tanisha blinked, her false eyelashes fluttering rapidly. She let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. Excuse me, I think the wine has gone to your head. I said I need the deposit by Tuesday. Or are you saying you want your nephew to be born in a state hospital like a pauper? I looked her dead in the eye. I am saying that I am not paying $15,000 for a birthing suite when you have state insurance. And Brad is certainly not moving into my garage to paint pictures that nobody buys. If you want a luxury berth, get a job. If you want a studio, pay rent. But the Bank of Jasmine is officially closed. The smile dropped from Tanisha's face, instantly replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated rage. She stood up so abruptly that her chair fell backward, crashing onto the floor. The silence in the dining room was heavy and suffocating. Tanisha stared at me with her mouth slightly open, unable to process the word no. It was a word she had rarely heard in her 30 years of life, especially not from me. She let out a sharp, incredulous laugh that sounded more like a bark. You are joking, right? She spat the words out. You have to be joking, Jasmine. We already told the hospital you are the guarantor. And Brad needs that garage. What do you expect him to do, paint in the living room with 7 screaming kids while I am trying to recover from a C-section? She looked around the table seeking validation, and of course she found it immediately. Mama Joyce stood up, her hands trembling slightly, not from age, but from indignation. She slammed her palm down on the table, causing the silverware to rattle. Jasmine Marie. She used my full government name, which meant she was switching into matriarch mode. The Bible says, to whom much is given, much is required. The Lord blessed you with that high-paying job and that big empty house so you could be a blessing to your family. Do not let the devil harden your heart over money. Your sister is carrying a life, a gift from God. How can you sit there in your expensive suit eating my food and deny your own flesh and blood? I looked at my mother, a woman whose mortgage I paid off 2 years ago, yet who still looked at me as if I were the villain. I looked at Brad, who had finally paused his video game but only looked annoyed that the argument was interrupting his leisure time. He did not offer to get a job. He did not offer to sell his gaming console. He just waited for me to fold like I always did. But something in me had shifted. I realized that if I gave them the garage today, they would demand the master bedroom tomorrow. There was no bottom to their need. I did not say another word. I simply grabbed my purse from the table. The sound of the leather scraping against the wood was the only sound in the room. I turned my back on them and started walking toward the front door. You are not going anywhere, Tanisha screamed. She moved faster than I thought a pregnant woman could. She scrambled over the pile of toys on the floor and threw herself in front of the door, spreading her arms wide to block my exit. Her eyes were wide and manic. You think you can just walk out? She yelled, causing the baby in the high chair to start wailing in terror. You are selfish, Jasmine. You are just jealous. You are a bitter, lonely woman who wants to punish me because I have a family, and you have nothing but a career. Brad stood up from the recliner, his face darkening. Hey, he shouted, pointing a finger at me. You are upsetting her, Jasmine. Just write the check and apologize so we can finish dinner. I reached for the door handle, my hand inches from Tanisha's shoulder. Move, Tanisha, I said, my voice low and dangerous. I am done. Tanisha shoved me back hard, her nails digging into my silk blouse. I barely had time to process the shove before Tanisha launched into the performance of a lifetime. With a dramatic gasp that would have embarrassed a telenovela actress, she threw herself backward. She did not stumble. She did not slip. She launched herself. She made sure to land on the thick plush area rug rather than the hardwood floor, but she screamed as if she had been thrown down a flight of concrete stairs. Oh God, my baby, she shrieked, clutching her stomach and rolling side to side. My stomach, help me! She pushed me. Jasmine tried to kill my baby. The transformation in the room was instantaneous and terrifying. Brad, who had been too lazy to get his own glass of water 10 minutes ago, suddenly sprang from the recliner with the agility of a professional athlete. He rushed toward me, his face contorted into a mask of aggressive righteousness. "You crazy witch!" he shouted, getting inches from my face, spraying spit as he screamed. "You put your hands on my wife. I saw you. You are trying to kill my kid because you are a jealous, bitter old maid." He shoved me hard against the doorframe. I stood there frozen not by fear, but by the sheer audacity of the lie. I am a nurse. I know what trauma looks like. I watched Tanisha carefully positioning her legs to look more vulnerable while checking to make sure her dress was still flattering. Mama Joyce was on her knees beside her praying loudly. "Jesus, protect this innocent child from the devil in this house." She looked up at me with genuine hatred in her eyes. "Get out, Jasmine. How could you hurt your sister like this?" Through the open front door I saw the real threat. The neighbors. Mrs. Patterson from across the street was already on her porch phone raised recording everything. Two teenagers were live streaming from the sidewalk. To them, I was not the victim of extortion. I was the well-dressed villain standing over a weeping pregnant woman. Tanisha saw the audience too. She pitched her voice louder so the phones could pick it up. "Why do you hate me, Jasmine?" she sobbed. "I just wanted us to be a family." Then she pulled her phone from her pocket. Her hands were shaking perfectly on cue. "Yes, I need emergency services," she cried into the receiver. "I am at 405 Oak Street. I am pregnant and I have been assaulted. My attacker is still on the premises. She is refusing to leave. Please hurry. I think I am losing the baby." She hung up and looked at me. For a split second, the sobbing stopped and a cold, victorious smirk flashed across her face. "You should have just written the check, Jasmine," she whispered so low only I could hear. "Now it is going to cost you a lot more than $15,000. The police arrived in less than 5 minutes. Two officers walked through the front door, their hands resting near their holsters. The first was a tall, older man named Officer Miller, and the second was a younger woman, Officer Davis. Tanisha saw them and immediately turned up the volume on her performance. She pushed me. "Officer," she wailed, clutching her stomach as she lay on the rug. "She tried to kill my baby because she is jealous. Arrest her. Please get her away from me." Mama Joyce stood over her, pointing a trembling finger at me. "She has lost her mind, officer. She attacked a pregnant woman." Officer Miller stepped toward me, his face stern. "Ma'am, I need you to step back and put your hands where I can see them. We have a report of aggravated assault." He reached for the handcuffs at his belt. Brad stood in the corner smirking slightly, thinking he had finally won. He thought I would panic. He thought I would scream. Instead, I calmly reached into my pocket. Officer Miller tensed up, but I moved slowly. "I am not reaching for a weapon, officer." I said, my voice steady and cold. "I am reaching for the truth." I pulled out my phone and opened the smart home application connected to the security camera I had installed in my mother's living room 3 months ago to monitor her blood pressure medication. I tapped the screen and held it up to Officer Miller's face. "Watch this," I said. On the screen, in high-definition night vision, he watched the replay. He saw me standing 5 feet away from Tanisha. He saw Tanisha check her footing, look at the rug, and then deliberately throw herself backward while screaming. He watched Brad rush over to assault me while I stood frozen in shock. Officer Miller watched it twice. Then he looked down at Tanisha, who was still moaning on the floor. "Ma'am," he said to Tanisha, his voice dropping all sympathy, "filing a false police report is a criminal offense. You might want to stand up now." Tanisha stopped crying instantly. Her face went from tragic to furious in a split second. She scrambled to her feet, glaring at me with pure venom. "Fine," she spat. "So she did not push me." "But you cannot let her leave, officer. Look at these children. She is their primary provider. If she walks out that door, I am pressing charges for child abandonment. These kids need her." Officer Miller looked around the chaotic room at the 7 children who were terrified and crying. He looked back at me, his expression conflicted. "Ma'am, is this true? Are you the legal guardian of these minors? If you have custody, you cannot just walk out on them. Tanisha crossed her arms, smiling triumphantly. She pays for everything she said. She is the only reason they eat. That makes her the guardian. I laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Officer, I am their aunt. I am the woman who has paid their rent, their tuition, and their medical bills for 10 years because these two refuse to work. But I have never signed a single adoption paper. I pulled up a digital copy of the lease agreement on my phone. Here are the tenants. Tanisha and Brad. They are the parents. They are the legal guardians. I am just the bank. And the bank has just been closed permanently. Officer Miller looked at the documents and then looked at Brad, who was trying to shrink into the wallpaper. Sir, he barked, step up and take control of your children. Your sister-in-law is free to go. I turned on my heel and walked out the front door into the cool night air, leaving the chaos where it belonged. Behind me. I walked out of my mother's house, and the silence of the evening felt like a physical weight lifting off my chest. My hands were trembling not from fear, but from the adrenaline of finally severing the limb that had been poisoning me for a decade. I climbed into my car and locked the doors. The leather seat felt cool against my back. For a moment I just sat there staring at the house where I grew up. The windows were glowing with warm yellow light, the very electricity that I paid for. Inside, they were probably laughing, believing that I would cool down in an hour and come back with my checkbook apologetic and submissive. They were wrong. I pulled my phone from my purse and dialed the number on the back of my Platinum American Express card. The automated voice asked for my reason for calling. I spoke clearly and without hesitation. I need to remove an authorized user. Tanisha Jackson. Yes, effective immediately. The representative asked if the card had been lost or stolen. I looked at the house again. Stolen, I whispered. It has been stolen for years. As soon as the representative confirmed the cancellation, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an attempted transaction. $200 at a liquor store just down the street from my mother's house. Brad had wasted no time trying to stock up for his celebration. I stared at the words on the screen. Transaction declined. A cold, satisfied smile touched my lips. Next, I opened my banking app. I transferred every cent from the joint emergency fund account I shared with my mother into my personal savings. That was $15,000 gone from their grasp in seconds. Then came the hardest call. The power company. The account for 405 Oak Street was in my name because my mother's credit was ruined years ago. I navigated the menu until I reached a human being. I am moving out, I told the operator. I need to disconnect service at this address immediately. The operator warned me that it would leave the residence without power within the hour. I told her I understood. I put the car in reverse and backed out of the driveway. My phone began to ring. The caller ID flashed Tanisha. I swiped to answer, putting it on speaker as I accelerated down the street. I expected screaming or crying, but Tanisha's voice was disturbingly calm. You think you are smart, don't you, Jasmine? She said. The lights just flickered, and Brad's card just got declined at the store. You are trying to starve us out. I kept my eyes on the road. I am not starving you, Tanisha. I am just refusing to feed the parasites anymore. You wanted to be the head of a household. Figure it out. Tanisha laughed, a low, dark sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. You have no idea who you are messing with. You think money is power. I am going to show you what real power is. You better watch your back, sister dear, because by tomorrow morning, you are going to wish you had just written that check. The line went dead. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I knew this was not an empty threat. Tanisha was lazy when it came to work, but when it came to revenge, she was the hardest working woman I knew. The next morning I arrived at the clinic hoping that the sterile environment of the oncology wing would provide a shield against the chaos of my personal life. I was wrong. I was in the middle of reviewing a patient chart at the nurse's station when the double doors at the end of the hallway burst open. The respectful silence of the ward was shattered not by a medical emergency, but by the shrill voice of my sister. "There she is," Tanisha screamed, pointing a manicured finger at me from 50 feet away. "There is the woman who is letting her own flesh and blood starve to death while she plays doctor." I froze. Beside her, Mama Joyce was clutching a large leather-bound Bible to her chest, wearing her most expensive Sunday hat on a Tuesday morning, looking like a grieving mother. They marched down the hallway, ignoring the visiting hours sign and the receptionist who was frantically trying to stop them. Tanisha was wearing a tight shirt that emphasized her baby bump, and she made sure to hold her back and waddle dramatically for maximum effect. Everyone stopped what they were doing. "Dr. Henderson." My supervising physician looked up from his computer, his reading glasses sliding down his nose. "Jasmine, what on earth is going on here?" he asked, his voice tight with disapproval. I stepped out from behind the counter, my face burning with a heat that had nothing to do with fever. "Tanisha, please lower your voice," I hissed, trying to herd them away from the patient rooms where people were fighting for their lives. "This is a place of healing, not a reality TV show stage. You need to leave right now." Tanisha laughed, a loud barking sound that echoed off the linoleum floors. "Oh, now you want to talk?" she yelled, turning to face the waiting room full of patients. "You did not want to talk last night when you cut off the power to my children's house." She looked at an elderly woman in a wheelchair seeking an audience. "Can you believe it, ma'am? My sister here makes 6 figures, but she turned off the lights on 7 children and a pregnant woman." Mama Joyce stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "We are just here to pray for you, baby," she said loudly enough for the entire staff to hear. "We are here to pray that the Lord softens your stone heart before it is too late. You are embarrassing the family, Jasmine. Just give your sister back her credit card and turn the electricity back on so we can leave." It was a masterclass in manipulation. To the outsiders, I looked like the cold, unfeeling villain, and they were the desperate family trying to survive. I saw the judgment in the eyes of the other nurses. They did not know about the gambling. They did not know about the fraud. They only saw a pregnant woman crying. Security was already on their way, but the damage was done. Tanisha grabbed a stack of health brochures from the counter and threw them into the air like confetti. "I am not leaving until I get what belongs to my kids," she shrieked. "You owe us, Jasmine. You owe us for everything." "Dr. Henderson stood up and walked over to me. His face was unreadable, but his tone was final. "Jasmine, get them out of here. Now. You have 10 minutes to fix this family drama, or do not bother coming back after your shift." As 2 security guards grabbed Tanisha by the arms, she looked back at me and smiled a terrifying grin that promised this was only the opening act. I sat in the oversized leather chair across from Dr. Henderson's mahogany desk, trying to stop my hands from shaking. The air conditioning hummed a low, monotonous drone that felt deafening in the silence. Outside this soundproof office, my sister was being dragged off the premises, but inside my entire career was hanging by a thread. Dr. Henderson took off his wire-rimmed glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, a gesture I knew meant he was exhausted and losing patience. "Jasmine, you are one of the best nurse practitioners this hospital has," he began, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. "But we are a private institution catering to high-profile clients. We cannot have domestic disputes playing out in our lobby." He turned his computer monitor around to face me. On the screen was a live stream. My stomach dropped. It was Tanisha's feed. She was filming from the sidewalk outside the hospital, crying about how the wealthy medical establishment was discriminating against a poor pregnant black woman. The video already had 5,000 views. The comments were flooding in, calling for a boycott of the hospital and demanding my termination. "She is weaponizing her pregnancy." "Jasmine," Dr. Henderson said quietly, pointing at the scrolling text. "And unfortunately, it is working. The board has already called me. They want to know why we employ someone who abandons children." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. This was not just about $15,000 for a birthing suite anymore. This was a targeted assassination attempt. Tanisha knew that my job was my shield. It was the only thing that separated me from the poverty she chose to live in. If she took away my license, she took away my power. She wanted to drag me down into the mud with her, so I would have no choice but to rely on the same toxic system she did. It was not just greed, it was envy. She could not stand that I had escaped the cycle. Dr. Henderson leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "I bought you some time," he said. "I told the board you are the victim of harassment, but I cannot hold them off forever. You have 48 hours to make this go away, Jasmine. If there is one more incident, one more scene, or one more viral video linking your name to this hospital, I will have to place you on indefinite administrative leave without pay. Do you understand?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I understood perfectly. Tanisha had declared total war. She did not just want my money, she wanted my destruction. I stood up and smoothed out my scrubs. "It will be handled, Dr. Henderson," I said, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. "I promise you it ends today." As I walked out of his office, I realized that playing defense was no longer an option. Tanisha wanted a villain, so I decided I would become the villain she feared most. The one who wins. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number of the private investigator I had hesitated to call earlier. I needed dirt, I needed leverage, and I needed to know exactly why Tanisha was so desperate for money that she would burn down my life to get it. I barely made it to my car before my phone started vibrating so violently it felt like a live wire in my pocket. I expected another angry text from Tanisha or a guilt-tripping voicemail from my mother. I was not prepared for what I saw when I unlocked the screen. My notifications were a blur of red badges: Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. They were all exploding. At the top of my feed was a post shared by Brad. It had been up for only 2 hours, and it already had 10,000 shares. The title of the post was "The Heartbreaking Truth About My Wife's Sister." Beneath the caption was a photo of me taken at a family barbecue 3 years ago. In the picture, I was laughing, holding a glass of champagne. Brad had cropped the image to make me look drunk and careless. Then came the text. It was a masterpiece of fiction. Brad claimed that when our grandmother passed away, she had left a secret inheritance intended for the grandchildren's education. He wrote that I, as the executor of the estate, had manipulated the legal documents to steal the entire fortune for myself, leaving Tanisha and his 7 children destitute. I sat in the driver's seat of my Mercedes, gripping the phone until my knuckles turned white. There was no secret fortune. My grandmother died with $2,000 in her bank account and a house full of love. I paid for her funeral. I paid off her outstanding medical debts. The only inheritance I received was her collection of porcelain angels and the trauma of watching my family fight over scraps. But the internet did not know that. They only saw Brad's sob story about a struggling artist trying to feed his family while his greedy sister-in-law lived in a penthouse on stolen money. I scrolled down to the comments and my stomach turned. They were vile. Complete strangers were calling for my nursing license to be revoked. People were posting the address of the clinic, urging others to harass me until I returned the money. One comment read, "Eat the rich." Another said, "She looks evil. I hope she loses everything." Brad had successfully weaponized the internet's hatred of inequality against me. He had turned his own laziness into a victim narrative. For a moment, I felt a wave of panic. How do you fight a lie that big? How do you prove you did not steal money that never existed? But then I looked closer at the post. Brad had included a link to a GoFundMe page titled "Help the Jackson Family Survive." The goal was set at $50,000. In 2 hours, they had already raised $5,000. Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place. This was not just revenge. This was a grift. Brad did not care about the truth. He cared about the cash flow. He was using my reputation as kindling to keep his fire warm. I took a screenshot of the post and the donation page. Then I opened my contacts and found the number for the private investigator I had hired earlier. Brad wanted to talk about hidden finances. He wanted to talk about stealing. Fine. If he wanted to play detective on social media, I was going to play detective in real life. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. I was not going home to hide. I was going to find out exactly where that $5,000 was going because I knew for a fact it was not going to feed those kids. I drove across town to the apartment complex where Tanisha and Brad had been living before their so-called financial collapse. Tanisha had told the entire family that the landlord was a heartless tyrant who had evicted them simply because they were a few days late on rent due to medical bills. I parked my car across the street and watched the building. It was a well-maintained complex with manicured hedges and a fresh coat of paint. It certainly did not look like the slum Tanisha had described to Mama Joyce to elicit sympathy. I saw an older man with a clipboard walking near the entrance inspecting the flower beds. That had to be Mr. Russo, the building manager. I stepped out of my car and approached him. When I introduced myself as Tanisha's sister, his expression instantly hardened. He looked like he was about to call the police. I raised my hands in a gesture of peace. I am not here to cause trouble, Mr. Russo. I just want to clear up some confusion regarding the eviction. My sister claims she was removed because of financial hardship. I am willing to settle any outstanding balance she might have left behind. Mr. Russo let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Hardship, he repeated, shaking his head in disbelief. Is that what she told you? Lady, your sister did not get evicted because she was broke. She got evicted for running an illegal subletting operation out of my property. I stared at him, unable to comprehend what he was saying. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his clipboard and handed it to me. It was a copy of the eviction notice. The cause for termination was listed clearly as lease violation, unauthorized subleasing. Mr. Russo crossed his arms and spilled the truth. Tanisha and Brad had moved out of the apartment 3 months ago. They had secretly moved into my mother's house claiming they were destitute, but they had kept the keys to this apartment. Instead of returning it to the landlord, they had rented it out to 3 college students for $2,000 a month in cash. They were double-dipping, living rent-free at my mother's house while collecting illegal rent from this apartment. But where did the money go? I asked, my voice trembling with rage. Mr. Russo pointed to a security camera mounted above the lobby door. That husband of hers, Brad. He came by on the 1st of every month to collect the cash from the students. I caught him last week when the neighbors complained about the noise. He was counting a stack of $100 bills right there in the parking lot. He told me he needed the liquidity for his art investments. I felt sick to my stomach. There was no poverty, there was no struggle. Tanisha had dragged her 7 children into a crowded house, with my mother disrupting her peace and draining her resources, not because they had nowhere to go, but because they wanted to turn their previous home into a cash cow for Brad. They had turned their own homelessness into a business model. I thanked Mr. Russo and took a picture of the eviction notice. As I walked back to my car, I realized that Tanisha was not just a victim of Brad's laziness. She was his accomplice. They were running a con on the entire family, and I had just found the smoking gun. I parked my car a block away from Lincoln Elementary School and walked to the chain-link fence near the basketball courts. It was recess, and hundreds of children were running around screaming with joy, but my eyes scanned the crowd for only one face. I found him sitting alone on a rusted metal bench, his hood pulled up over his head, despite the warm afternoon sun. Marcus. My 10-year-old nephew looked like a shadow of the vibrant boy he used to be. His shoulders were hunched, and he was staring at his sneakers, which were held together by gray duct tape. I called his name softly through the fence. He looked up, and for a second his eyes lit up with hope before being replaced by fear. He looked around nervously to make sure no one was watching before walking over to me. "Auntie Jazz," he whispered, gripping the fence with his small fingers. "You shouldn't be here. Mom said if we talk to you, the police will take us away." My heart broke into 1,000 pieces. They were using fear to silence a child. I reached into my purse and pulled out a large turkey sandwich and a juice box I had bought on the way over. I passed them through the gap in the fence. Marcus tore into the sandwich like he hadn't eaten in days. He didn't even chew, he just swallowed bites whole. I watched him fighting back tears of rage. "Slow down, baby," I told him gently. "When did you eat last?" He paused, wiping crumbs from his mouth. "I had dinner last night," he mumbled. A slice of pizza. Dad said we have to skip breakfast now. He says groceries are too expensive because of inflation. I felt the blood boil in my veins. Inflation. That was the lie Brad told to cover his greed. But Marcus wasn't finished. He looked down at his taped shoes and then back at me, his eyes filling with tears. "But Auntie Jazz," he whispered, his voice trembling. "If we are so poor, why did Dad come home with new shoes yesterday? He brought home a box of retro Jordans. He hid them in the trunk of his car, but I saw them. He told us we have to sacrifice for the new baby, but he spent $200 on sneakers while my stomach hurts." I reached through the fence and squeezed his hand. I needed him to know he wasn't crazy and he wasn't alone. "Listen to me, Marcus," I said, my voice fierce and steady. "You are not going to be hungry anymore. I promise you. I need you to be brave for me just a little longer. Do you know where your dad keeps his papers? The ones he hides from your mom?" Marcus nodded slowly, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "He keeps a box under the passenger seat of his car. He thinks we don't know. But I know." I told him to get back to class before the bell rang. As I watched him walk away clutching the empty juice box like a treasure, I knew I had crossed a line. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was war. And I was coming for everything Brad loved, starting with those shoes. I watched Marcus run back toward the school building, his oversized backpack bouncing against his small frame. Once he disappeared behind the double doors, I looked down at the crumpled ball of paper in my hand. It felt heavy like a stone. I walked back to my car and sat in the driver's seat, locking the doors before I dared to open it. I smoothed the paper out on the leather steering wheel. It was not a drawing, it was not a note from his teacher. It was a screenshot that had been printed out on Tanisha's home printer. The ink was low, causing streaks across the page, but the numbers were undeniable. At the top of the page was the logo for a popular sports betting application. Below that was a profile name that I recognized immediately: Big Brad Art. I scanned down to the account summary section. My breath hitched in my throat. In bold red letters next to the words "Outstanding Balance" was a negative sign followed by the number $21,450. I stared at the number, blinking rapidly, trying to make sense of the zeros. This was not a few dollars lost on a friendly poker game. This was the price of a car. This was a year of tuition at a state university. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The pieces of the puzzle that had been confusing me for years finally snapped together to form a picture of absolute negligence. The reason Brad never had money for groceries, despite Tanisha claiming he was selling art online. The reason they were evicted from their apartment, despite the subletting income I had discovered earlier. The reason Marcus was starving while Brad bought new sneakers. Brad was not just lazy, he was a gambling addict. He was betting on fantasy football leagues and basketball games, chasing a high, while his children went to bed with empty stomachs. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I thought about every check I had written to Tanisha over the years. I thought about the cash I slipped into her purse when she cried about needing diapers. I had not been feeding my nieces and nephews. I had been funding Brad's addiction. I had been the enabler keeping his account active so he could lose more money. The $20,000 on this paper was likely just the tip of the iceberg. If he owed this much to a legal app, I could only imagine what he might owe to loan sharks or credit card companies. I pulled out my phone and took a high-resolution photo of the paper, making sure the account name and the balance were clearly visible. Then I carefully folded the original and placed it in the hidden compartment of my glove box. This was no longer just a family dispute about boundaries. This was proof of financial endangerment. Brad was drowning, and he was using his children as life rafts. I started the engine, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Tanisha had called me selfish for cutting them off. But now I knew the truth. Cutting them off was the only way to stop the bleeding. I needed to find out how deep this hole really was, and to do that I needed a professional. It was time to call the private investigator I had been hesitating to hire. I was done playing nice. I was going to turn over every rock in Brad's life, and I was going to expose whatever crawled out from underneath. That night, I sat in my home office with the lights off, except for the glow of my laptop screen and a single desk lamp. The shadows in the room felt heavy, matching the weight in my chest. I had the photo of the gambling debt on my screen, but I knew it was just one thread in a much larger tapestry of lies. Brad had always been vague about his past. He claimed he was a free spirit who rejected his family's corporate lifestyle in Connecticut to pursue art. For years we bought that story. But looking at the $20,000 debt, I realized he wasn't a rebel. He was a runaway. I opened a secure browser window and typed in a number I had saved years ago but never used. It belonged to Marcus Vance, a private investigator who had helped a colleague of mine during a messy divorce. He answered on the second ring, his voice gravelly and professional. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I told him I needed a full background check on Bradley Thomas Wentworth. I needed financial records, criminal history, and most importantly, I needed to know why a man with the last name Wentworth, a name associated with old money and Ivy League schools, was living in his mother-in-law's basement in Atlanta. Vance was efficient. He told me he would start immediately, but warned me that digging into wealthy families often triggered alarms. I told him I didn't care. I transferred the retainer fee and sat back in my chair watching the transaction complete. I felt a strange mix of guilt and power. Tanisha would call this a betrayal. She would say I was spying on family, but Tanisha had forfeited the right to privacy when she tried to destroy my career to fund her husband's secrets. 3 hours later, my secure email chimed. Vance moved fast. The subject line simply read, "Preliminary Report." I clicked it open, and my breath caught in my throat. Attached was a series of court documents from 5 years ago. They were sealed juvenile records that Vance had somehow accessed along with police reports from Connecticut. The narrative that unfolded on my screen was not one of a misunderstood artist. It was a rap sheet, petty theft, forgery, and a restraining order filed by not a stranger, but by his own parents. I leaned closer to the screen, reading the details. The restraining order wasn't just for harassment. It cited financial elder abuse. Brad hadn't just rejected his parents' money, he had tried to steal it. He had forged checks in his grandmother's name to pay off bookies in New York. His parents hadn't cut him off because he wanted to paint. They cut him off because he was a predator. And now he had found a new host. My family. The realization made me cold. I wasn't just dealing with a lazy brother-in-law. I was dealing with a professional con artist who had been refining his craft for a decade. And Tanisha was his willing accomplice or his biggest victim. I needed to find out which one it was before I burned them both down. My hands were shaking as I closed the file from the private investigator. If Brad was capable of stealing from his own grandmother, then nothing was off limits. A cold knot of dread formed in my stomach as I opened a new tab on my browser. I typed in the address for the National Credit Bureau. I had not checked my credit score in 6 months because I paid every bill on time and had zero debt. Or so I thought. When the page finally loaded, I felt the blood drain from my face. My credit score, which had been a perfect 820 just half a year ago, was now sitting at 540. It was in the red zone, the danger zone. I clicked on the full report, and the screen filled with a sea of red warning banners. Total outstanding debt, $85,000. I stared at the number blinking rapidly, trying to make sense of it. I did not have a mortgage. I paid off my car years ago. My student loans were cleared. Yet here they were. 3 separate federal student loans taken out in the last 2 years, totaling $40,000. And below that were 5 credit cards: Visa, MasterCard, American Express. All of them opened in my name, and all of them maxed out to their absolute limit. I clicked on the details of the student loans. They were for an online unaccredited art and design university, the kind of place that accepts anyone with a pulse and charges Ivy League prices. Brad. It had to be. But how? How did they get past the security checks? Then I saw the billing address listed on the accounts. It was not my penthouse address. It was not even my mother's address. It was a P.O. box in East Atlanta. I cross-referenced the box number with the report the private investigator had just sent me. It was a match. Brad had rented a P.O. box solely to intercept the mail for the fraudulent accounts he opened in my name. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This was not just borrowing money. This was identity theft. This was a federal crime. Tanisha and Brad had stolen my social security number, likely from old tax documents I kept at my mother's house. They had impersonated me online, signed electronic promissory notes, and spent the last 2 years living a lifestyle they could not afford on my credit. That vacation to Miami Tanisha posted about last year, paid for by me. The new gaming setup Brad bragged about, paid for by me. I felt a scream building in my throat, but I swallowed it down. Screaming would not fix my credit score. Screaming would not pay off $85,000 of fraudulent debt. I printed every single page of the report. The sound of the printer rhythmically spitting out page after page of evidence was the only sound in the apartment. I stacked the papers into a neat pile. This was the smoking gun. This was the proof that Mama Joyce could not pray away. I grabbed my car keys. It was time to show my mother exactly who she was protecting. She wanted me to be a blessing to the family. Well, I was about to bless them with the truth. I drove to my mother's house with the stack of financial records riding in the passenger seat like a silent passenger. The house was unusually quiet when I arrived because Tanisha and the kids were out spending money they did not have. I found Mama Joyce in the dining room, sitting at the head of the mahogany table that I had bought for her 2 Christmases ago. I did not hug her. I did not ask how she was feeling. I simply walked to the opposite end of the long table and sat down. The physical distance between us felt like a canyon. I slid the thick manila envelope across the polished wood. It stopped right in front of her hands. "Open it," I said, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. Mama Joyce looked at the envelope and then at me. She let out a long, weary sigh as if my presence was a burden she had to endure. "Jasmine, if this is about the electric bill, I already told you that Tanisha is going to pay you back when Brad sells his paintings." "It is not about the electric bill, Mama," I interrupted. "Look at the papers." She put on her reading glasses and slowly pulled out the credit reports and the student loan applications. I watched her eyes scan the pages. I waited for the shock. I waited for the outrage. I waited for her to realize that her son-in-law had committed a federal crime against her own daughter. But the outrage never came. Instead, she just shook her head and placed the papers back on the table. "So they borrowed your name," she said casually, removing her glasses. "They were desperate, Jasmine. Brad told me he needed to build his credit score so they could buy a house and move out. He said he just needed a co-signer, but you were being difficult, so he did what he had to do to provide for his family." I stared at her. My mouth went dry. "You knew," I whispered. "You knew they forged my signature. You knew they stole my identity, and you said nothing." Mama Joyce slammed her hand on the table. "Don't you dare raise your voice at me in my house." Yes, I knew. And I told them it was wrong, but I also know that family helps family. You have perfect credit, Jasmine. You have a high-paying job. A few loans are not going to hurt you, but sending your pregnant sister's husband to jail over some paperwork, that is evil. You are prioritizing money over blood. I felt a coldness spread through my chest that was absolute and final. In that moment, I realized that my mother did not see me as a daughter. She saw me as a resource. To her, I was just an insurance policy for Tanisha's mistakes. She honestly believed that Tanisha's right to be comfortable superseded my right to be safe. "It is a felony, Mama," I said, standing up and taking the folder back. It is not borrowing, it is theft. And since you seem to think it is acceptable, I guess you won't mind explaining that to a judge. Mama Joyce stood up too, her face twisting with anger. If you call the police on them, you are no daughter of mine. You will destroy this family. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me, and I realized the family was already destroyed. She had broken it the day she decided one daughter was the golden child and the other was the sacrifice. I walked out of the house without looking back. She wanted me to save the family. I was going to save myself instead. I sat there in the dim light of my home office, staring at the glowing screen until my eyes burned. The initial background check had hinted at trouble, but the supplementary file Marcus Vance sent over 20 minutes later painted a portrait of a sociopath. I opened the folder labeled Connecticut Incident. Inside were scanned copies of police reports that had been buried under expensive lawyers and family connections. 7 years ago in Hartford, Brad had been involved in a single vehicle collision. He claimed he swerved to avoid a deer totaling his Porsche Cayenne. The insurance payout was $60,000, but the investigator notes revealed the truth. Traffic cameras showed no deer. The skid marks were inconsistent with a swerve. They were consistent with a deliberate crash. He had staged the accident to pay off gambling debts. His family's lawyers had managed to reduce the charges to reckless driving to avoid a felony conviction, but the insurance company had blacklisted him for life. But that was not the worst part. I clicked on the next document. It was a sworn affidavit signed by Eleanor Wentworth, Brad's mother. The woman Tanisha was so desperate to impress. The document detailed a theft that had occurred 2 weeks before Brad left Connecticut for good. His grandmother was suffering from dementia, living in the family estate. Brad had volunteered to sit with her during the weekends. During those visits, he had systematically emptied her jewelry box, replacing diamonds and vintage pearls with high-quality paste replicas. He stole $50,000 worth of heirlooms from a confused, dying woman who trusted him. I felt bile rise in my throat. This was the man who sat at my mother's table and preached about family values. This was the man who judged me for being a career woman while he lived off the spoils of elder abuse. His parents had not just cut him off financially, they had exiled him to protect the rest of the clan. They gave him a choice: leave the state and never come back or face prosecution. He chose to run. He chose to find a new victim. And he found Tanisha. I looked at the picture of Brad from his booking photo. He looked younger, but the arrogance in his eyes was the same. He did not care about art. He did not care about the baby coming. He was a parasite looking for a host, and he had drained Tanisha dry. Now he was trying to latch on to me. I printed the affidavit and held it in my hands. The paper felt heavy with betrayal. Tanisha thought her husband was a misunderstood genius, rejected by a cruel, wealthy family. She had no idea she was sleeping next to a monster who robbed his own grandmother. I knew what I had to do. Confronting Brad would be useless. He was a professional liar. Confronting Tanisha would be futile. She was too deep in denial. I needed to go to the source. I needed to talk to the people who knew exactly what Bradley Thomas Wentworth was capable of. I picked up my phone and searched for a number in Greenwich, Connecticut. It was time to introduce myself to my in-laws. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, watching the Atlanta skyline glittering below me like a sea of diamonds. From this height, the cars looked like toys and the people were invisible. It was peaceful up here, quiet, controlled, everything my life had not been for the last 48 hours. In my hand, I held the thick file containing the evidence of Brad's fraud and Tanisha's complicity. The logical part of my brain, the nurse practitioner who dealt with facts and triage, told me to drive to the precinct right now. If I handed this file to the police tonight, Brad would be in cuffs by morning. But then I thought about Tanisha's performance at the hospital. I thought about the thousands of strangers online calling me a monster. I thought about Mama Joyce sitting at that mahogany table, justifying a felony because of family loyalty. If I had Brad arrested quietly, Tanisha would spin the narrative again. She would cry to the church. She would tell the internet that I used my expensive lawyers to frame her husband because I was jealous of their love. She would play the martyr, and the community would rally around her. And worst of all, she would keep the children. Brad would go to jail, but Tanisha would raise the next generation to be just like him. Number. A quiet victory was not enough. I needed a kill shot. I needed to dismantle their lies in a way that was so public and so irrefutable that not even my mother could deny it. I needed to cut the head off the snake in front of the entire village. I turned away from the window and picked up my phone. It was late, but I knew David, my attorney, would answer. He picked up on the first ring. I did not waste time. I told him everything: the gambling debt, the identity theft, the elder abuse in Connecticut. David listened in silence, his breathing the only sound on the line. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. "Jasmine, this is a slam dunk," he said. "We can get him for fraud, larceny, and identity theft. We can get Tanisha for conspiracy, but custody is trickier. Unless you can prove the children are in immediate danger, the courts usually side with the mother." I looked at the photo of Marcus and his taped shoes. "I am going to prove it, David," I said, my voice cold and hard. "But I need a venue. I need a stage where they feel safe enough to brag, safe enough to reveal exactly who they are. I am going to throw Tanisha the baby shower of her dreams. I want you to prepare the custody papers and have the police on standby, but do not serve them yet. I want everyone there. His parents, the church, the neighbors. When I take them down, I want witnesses." David hesitated. "You are playing a dangerous game, Jasmine. If this goes wrong, you could be seen as malicious." I smiled at my reflection in the glass. "It won't go wrong," I assured him. "Because for the first time in my life, I am not trying to be the good daughter. I am being the surgeon. And sometimes to save the patient, you have to cut them open." I hung up the phone. The plan was set. Now I just had to make the hardest call of my life. I had to call my sister and pretend that I had surrendered. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes for a moment, summoning every ounce of acting ability I possessed. I needed to sound broken. I needed to sound like the submissive, dutiful sister they had trained me to be for 30 years. I needed to sound like I had lost. I dialed Tanisha's number and waited. It rang 4 times before she answered. She did not say hello. She simply breathed into the phone, waiting for me to speak first, enjoying the power dynamic she thought she held. "Tanisha," I said, my voice trembling with a carefully manufactured hesitation. "I have been doing a lot of thinking since I left Mama's house. I was wrong." The silence on the other end was deafening, but I pushed through. I was just so stressed with work and the shock of the news. I reacted poorly. I should not have cut off the lights. I should not have frozen the cards. "You are my sister, and that baby is my blood. I don't want to lose you over money." I heard a muffled sound in the background, likely Tanisha putting her hand over the receiver to whisper to Brad. When she came back on the line, her voice was still icy, but I could hear the curiosity. "Well, you certainly have a funny way of showing love, Jasmine." Brad is still furious. He says he is going to talk to a lawyer about emotional distress. I swallowed the urge to laugh. "Tell him, please don't do that," I pleaded. "I want to make it right. I want to fix this. Look, I know you wanted that birthing suite, and I know things have been tight. So I want to make you a peace offering. I want to throw you the baby shower. Not a backyard barbecue. I mean, a real event. I am talking about the platinum package at the St. Regis Hotel. Catered dinner, live music, professional photography. I want to introduce you and Brad to society properly. I want to show everyone that the Jackson family is thriving." The change in the atmosphere was instantaneous. I could practically hear Tanisha's greed salivating through the phone line. "The St. Regis," she repeated, her voice dropping an octave. "You mean the ballroom with the crystal chandeliers? The one where the mayor had his daughter's wedding?" "Yes," I said. "The very same. I will pay for everything. The venue, the food, the designer dress you wanted, all of it. I just want us to be a family again, and I want Brad to be there standing by your side so I can publicly apologize to him too." Tanisha let out a long, dramatic sigh, feigning reluctance. Well, I guess if you are truly sorry, we can consider it. But Brad's parents need to be invited. He wants them to see that we are doing well. I smiled a cold, predatory smile that Tanisha could not see. That is a wonderful idea, I said. I will send the invitations myself. We will make sure the Wentworths are front and center. We finalized the details in 10 minutes. Tanisha went from threatening to sue me to demanding a lobster tower and a specific brand of champagne. She took the bait hook, line, and sinker. She was so blinded by the promise of luxury and public validation that she did not ask why I had changed my mind so quickly. She did not question the sudden generosity. She just saw dollar signs. I hung up the phone and the mask of the apologetic sister vanished instantly. My face returned to stone. They wanted a show. I was going to give them the greatest show of their lives. And when the curtain fell, they would wish they had never answered the phone. I had barely placed my phone on the marble countertop when it began to vibrate again. It was not a call this time. It was a barrage of text messages. The name on the screen was Brad. For a man who claimed to be traumatized by my financial abuse 24 hours ago, he certainly recovered quickly once the word luxury was mentioned. I picked up the phone and watched the demands roll in like a ticker tape of greed. He did not start with thank you. He did not start with an apology for calling me a witch online. His first message read, "Make sure the bar is stocked with Blantons, the single barrel." My dad drinks nothing else. I typed back a simple thumbs-up emoji. The next message arrived seconds later. "We need a seafood tower, not the small ones. I want Maine lobster tails and king crab legs. Tanisha has been craving shellfish." I almost laughed out loud. Tanisha was allergic to shellfish. Brad wanted the lobster for himself. He wanted to sit at the St. Regis cracking crab legs like a king while I footed the bill. I replied, "Done. Anything else?" Then came the message I had been waiting for. The message that sealed his fate. Brad wrote, "I am going to invite my parents. They need to fly in from Connecticut. Since we are doing this at the St. Regis, I think it is time they see how well we are doing. I want them to see that I made it without their help. Make sure they are seated at the head table with us." I stared at the screen, feeling a cold thrill run down my spine. Brad was walking right into the trap. He genuinely believed that if he threw a fancy enough party, his parents would forget that he stole their jewelry and wrecked their car. He thought the St. Regis ballroom would act as a smokescreen for his failures. He wanted to use my money to cosplay as a successful provider. He had no idea that I had already spoken to his mother. He had no idea that the only reason they would agree to come was not to celebrate him, but to help me destroy him. I typed back, "That is a wonderful idea, Brad. I will make sure the travel arrangements are first class. Send me their contact info." A few seconds later, he sent the numbers. Then he sent one final message. "Also bring your checkbook to the party. The realtor for that house we want needs the gift letter signed for the down payment. We can do it before the speeches." I looked at the words gift letter. In the world of real estate, that was a document stating that the money given for a down payment was a gift and not a loan. He wanted me to sign away $50,000 legally so he could buy a house in his name. He was trying to lock me into a financial corner before the cake was even cut. I replied, "No problem. I will have everything ready." I set the phone down. The stage was set. He wanted lobster. He wanted top-shelf bourbon. He wanted his parents front and center. And he wanted my signature. I was going to give him all of it. But the signature he was going to get wasn't on a check. It was going to be on a witness statement. "Enjoy the lobster, Brad," I whispered to the empty room. "It is going to be your last meal as a free man." The lobby of the Four Seasons was quiet, the kind of quiet that money buys. I sat in a velvet armchair watching the revolving doors. At exactly 2 o'clock, Mrs. Wentworth walked in. They did not look like people coming to a family reunion. They looked like board members arriving for a hostile takeover. Eleanor Wentworth was draped in cashmere, her silver hair coiffed to perfection, while Harrison Wentworth walked beside her in a bespoke suit that cost more than my sister's car. They spotted me and approached with an air of weary resignation. I stood up to greet them, but Eleanor waved her hand, dismissing the pleasantries. "Let's make this quick, Ms. Jackson," she said, her voice crisp and cool. "We only flew down here because you said Bradley was involved in significant legal trouble that could impact the Wentworth estate. If this is just another one of his schemes to beg for money, you can tell him the bank is closed." I motioned for them to sit. "It is not a scheme, Mrs. Wentworth," I said, sliding a leather portfolio across the low table. "It is an intervention, but not for Brad, for his children." They looked at the folder with distaste. To them, their grandchildren were abstract concepts, distant relatives they had never met and had no interest in knowing, especially since they were born of a marriage they disapproved of. Harrison opened the file. The first photo was of Marcus standing in the schoolyard in his taped shoes. The second was the eviction notice. The third was the gambling debt. I watched their faces closely. I expected pity. I expected sadness. Instead, I saw cold, hard fury, not because their grandchildren were suffering, but because a Wentworth was living in squalor. Harrison's face turned a shade of crimson that matched the carpet. "He is gambling," he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. "He is gambling $20,000 while his son walks around looking like a beggar. This is unacceptable. A Wentworth does not live like this." Eleanor pointed a manicured nail at the photo of the eviction notice. "We gave him a trust fund," she hissed. "A small one, but enough to get started. He told us he was investing in a gallery. He told us he was a patron of the arts." She looked up at me, her eyes narrowing. "Is this true? Is he really living in your mother's basement?" "He is," I confirmed. "And he is using your name to run scams. He is telling people he is the heir to the Wentworth fortune to get lines of credit. He is ruining your reputation down here. And if he gets arrested for the identity theft he committed against me, the headlines won't just say local man arrested. They will say Wentworth heir charged with fraud." That was the trigger, the threat of public scandal. Harrison slammed the folder shut. "We are done protecting him," he said. "We cut him off to teach him a lesson, but clearly he has not learned. He is a parasite." Eleanor looked at me with a newfound respect. "What do you need us to do?" she asked. I leaned forward. "I am throwing a party tomorrow night. A baby shower. He thinks you are coming to validate him. He thinks you are coming to give him money. I need you to come. I need you to smile. And then when the moment is right, I need you to tell the truth. I need you to tell everyone exactly who Bradley Wentworth really is." Harrison stood up, buttoning his jacket. "We will be there. And we will make sure he never uses our name to con another soul again." As they walked away, I realized that Brad had made a fatal error. He thought his parents hated me because I was black or because I was working class. He was wrong. They hated failure. And tomorrow night, they were going to erase their biggest failure permanently. I arrived at the house holding a heavy black garment bag emblazoned with the gold logo of the most expensive boutique in Lenox Mall. Tanisha did not greet me at the door. She simply reached out and snatched the bag from my hands, her eyes wild with anticipation. She did not ask how I paid for it. She did not ask if I was okay. She just wanted to know if it sparkled. I watched her retreat into the bathroom to change her movements, frantic and greedy, like a child tearing into Christmas wrapping paper. I sat on the edge of the sofa, trying to ignore the sticky juice stains on the cushions. Mama Joyce was in the kitchen humming a hymn, convinced that her prayers had fixed the family fracture. She had no idea that I was not here to mend fences. I was here to dress the turkey before roasting it. The bathroom door creaked open and Tanisha stepped out. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to gasp in horror. The dress was a floor-length gown covered in thousands of gold sequins. I had deliberately purchased it 2 sizes too small. It was a mermaid cut, which was the least forgiving silhouette possible for a woman 8 months pregnant. The fabric was stretched so tight across her midsection that I could see the outline of her belly button through the sequins. Her chest was spilling out of the neckline in a way that was not alluring but alarming. She looked like a sausage casing wrapped in tinfoil. But when Tanisha looked in the hallway mirror, she did not see the truth. She preened, turning side to side, admiring the way the light caught the cheap plastic sequins. She ran her hands over her hips, her face glowing with pure, unadulterated vanity. "Look at me," she whispered, her voice thick with self-satisfaction. "I look like a queen. Brad is going to lose his mind when he sees this. He always said I should have been a model." She turned to me, expecting validation. Well, she demanded, spinning around so the skirt bunched up awkwardly around her swollen ankles. "What do you think? Do I look rich?" I smiled a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "You look unforgettable, Tanisha," I said. "You are going to be the brightest thing in the room." I was not lying. She looked ridiculous. She looked like a caricature of wealth, a desperate attempt to mimic class without understanding it. The dress was loud, tacky, and ill-fitting. It was the perfect costume for the role she was about to play. The fool. Mama Joyce came out of the kitchen and clasped her hands together. "Oh, baby, look at you," she cooed, wiping a tear from her eye. "You look like royalty." "See, Jasmine, I knew you would come through. This is what sisters do. They make each other shine." Tanisha walked back toward the mirror, blowing a kiss to her reflection. She was completely absorbed in her own fantasy. She thought the tight fit was sexy. She thought the gold was glamorous. She had no idea that I had chosen this dress specifically because it restricted her movement. When the walls started closing in on her tomorrow night, she literally would not be able to run. She was trussed up and ready for the slaughter, and she was too busy admiring the packaging to notice the knife in my hand. "Wear it in good health, Tanisha," I thought as I stood up to leave. "It is the last nice thing you are ever going to own." The VIP holding room at the St. Regis was draped in velvet and smelled of fresh orchids and expensive perfume. But underneath it all there was the distinct scent of desperation. Brad was pacing back and forth in a tuxedo that I knew he had rented using one of the credit cards he stole from me. He checked his watch every 30 seconds. When I walked in, he practically lunged at me. "Did you bring it?" he asked, his eyes darting to my purse. He did not ask how I was. He did not say hello. He just wanted the signature that would unlock his future. I reached into my bag and pulled out a sleek leather folder. "I have the check, Brad," I said, keeping my voice low and submissive. $50,000, just like you asked." His eyes widened, and he reached for it, but I pulled it back slightly. "There is just one thing. My accountant said that because of the size of the gift and the tax implications, I need you to sign an acknowledgement of receipt. It is just a formality so the IRS doesn't flag my accounts." I produced a document that I had prepared with my lawyer only hours ago. It was dense, single-spaced, and filled with legal jargon. Brad scoffed, rolling his eyes. "You and your rules, Jasmine. You always have to make everything complicated. Just give me the pen." He did not sit down to read the document. He did not put on his glasses. He did not scan the clauses. He was looking past the paper at the check sitting on the table. In his mind, he was already spending the money. He was already imagining the look on his father's face when he announced he was buying a mansion. He grabbed the Mont Blanc pen from my hand and scribbled his signature on the line marked "Recipient." I watched the ink dry. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Brad thought he was signing a receipt for a gift. In reality, he had just signed a confession of judgment. By signing that paper, he had legally acknowledged that the $50,000 was not a gift, but a loan, and he had also accepted full liability for the $85,000 of debt he had racked up in my name. The fine print explicitly stated that he admitted to the identity theft and agreed to immediate wage garnishment and asset liquidation to repay me. He had just signed a confession to a felony and a repayment plan in one stroke. "There," I said, slipping the document back into my folder and handing him the check. "It is all yours." Brad snatched the check and kissed it, holding it up to the light. Finally, he breathed a look of pure triumph on his face. Finally, we are going to live the life we deserve. Tanisha turned away from the mirror where she had been admiring her sequins. Did you get it, baby? She asked. Brad nodded, smirking at me. I got it. And now we are going to go out there and show everyone who the real head of this family is. I stood there quietly, clutching my purse. The check I gave him was real, but I had put a stop payment order on it 10 minutes before I walked into the room. It would bounce the moment he tried to deposit it. But the document he signed was legally binding forever. He thought he had just won the lottery. I knew he had just signed his own death warrant. Shall we go? I asked, gesturing toward the ballroom doors where the music was already playing. Your guests are waiting. I slipped out of the ballroom through the service entrance, leaving the noise of the string quartet and the clinking champagne glasses behind me. The air outside was cool and smelled of exhaust and impending rain. I walked toward the far end of the valet lot where a nondescript black sedan was parked in the shadows away from the luxury sports cars and limousines. As I approached, the tinted window rolled down slowly, revealing a woman with a stern face and tired eyes. It was Mrs. Gable, the senior caseworker from Child Protective Services. I leaned against the car, trying to keep my posture casual in case anyone was watching. Is everything set? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Gable looked down at a clipboard in her lap. We have reviewed the evidence you submitted, Miss Jackson. The eviction notices, the gambling debts, and the school reports regarding the children's malnutrition are compelling. But for an emergency removal tonight, we need to witness immediate endangerment or severe neglect. We cannot just storm in there because they are bad with money. I nodded, understanding the legal tightrope she was walking. You will get your proof, I promised her. Right now, my sister and her husband are ordering bottles of wine that cost more than their rent. They have 7 children inside that ballroom. I want you to watch what happens when the food comes out. Watch who eats and who does not. Watch who is supervising the toddler near the open balcony doors. Watch what happens when they get drunk and forget they are parents. Mrs. Gable pursed her lips and looked toward the glowing entrance of the hotel. We have 2 officers on standby around the corner, she said. If what you say is true, and these children are being neglected in a public setting while the parents are intoxicated, we will intervene. But be aware, Ms. Jackson, once we step in, there is no going back. The state takes custody. It is a traumatic process. I looked back at the hotel. Through the glass doors, I could see Tanisha laughing, her head thrown back, the sequins on her tight dress catching the light. She looked happy. She looked carefree. She looked like a woman who had successfully scammed her way to the top. I thought of Marcus and his hungry eyes. I thought of the baby Tanisha was carrying, a baby she was already using as a bargaining chip. I know the cost, I said, my voice steady. But leaving them with those 2 is not a life. It is a slow death. I would rather they be traumatized for one night than starved for a lifetime. Mrs. Gable nodded once, a sharp professional gesture. Go back inside. Give us the signal when you are ready. We will be watching. I turned and walked back toward the light and the music. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I was about to unleash a government agency on my own family. I was about to turn a celebration into a crime scene. I adjusted the strap of my dress and pushed the guilt down into the pit of my stomach. I was not the villain here. I was the rescue team, and the operation was about to begin. I stood in the center of the St. Regis ballroom, watching the crew hoist the massive 20-foot LED screen into place. It rose slowly toward the crystal chandeliers like a monolith. To the hotel staff and the event planners, this was just another extravagant decoration for a wealthy family's celebration. They assumed the screen would display a montage of cute baby photos, sonograms, and perhaps a sentimental video of Tanisha and Brad's love story. They had no idea that they were installing the weapon that would end my sister's marriage. I walked over to the audio-visual technician, a young man named Kevin who looked exhausted. Is it ready? I asked. He nodded, handing me an HDMI cable. All set, Ms. Jackson. We tested the resolution. It is crystal clear. Do you want to do a final run-through of the file? I took the cable and plugged it into my laptop. My hands were steady. I opened the presentation software and clicked on the file simply labeled The Truth. I hit play. On the giant screen behind me, the first image appeared. It was not a baby picture. It was the screenshot of Brad's $20,000 gambling debt. The red numbers were 10 feet tall, glowing ominously in the dim room. I clicked next. The eviction notice for unauthorized subleasing. Next, the police report from Connecticut detailing the theft of his grandmother's jewelry. Next, the credit report showing the student loans taken out in my name. It was a slideshow of destruction. Every slide was a nail in their coffin. I watched the images cycle through high-definition evidence of their greed and criminality. It was perfect. I closed the laptop and unplugged the cable. Leave it on standby, I told Kevin. I want it to be black until I give the signal. He gave me a thumbs up, not asking questions about the content he had just seen. In this industry, you learn to ignore the dirty laundry of the rich. As the crew began to pack up their gear, leaving the room in a heavy, expectant silence, my phone buzzed on the table. I looked down at the screen. It was a text from Tanisha. Even at midnight the night before her big day, she was hustling. The message read, "Hey sis, just a reminder. Brad says to make sure the cash gift is in a discreet envelope. He does not want to walk around with a check. Also make sure the photographer gets a shot of us receiving it. We want to frame it." I stared at the words, feeling a cold smile spread across my face. They were so predictable. They were so confident in their manipulation that they were scripting their own victory lap. Tanisha wanted a photo of the moment I handed over the money. She wanted a permanent record of my submission. I typed back a simple reply. "Do not worry. I have prepared something very special for Brad. He will never forget this gift." I put the phone away and looked up at the blank black screen towering over the dance floor. Tanisha was right about one thing. We were going to frame a moment tomorrow. But it would not be a picture of a happy family. It would be the picture of a house of cards collapsing in real time. I picked up my purse and walked out of the ballroom, leaving the darkness behind me. The trap was set. The bait was taken. Now all I had to do was wait for the guests to arrive. The doors to the grand ballroom opened at 6 o'clock sharp, revealing a world that Tanisha had only ever seen in magazines. The room was bathed in amber light reflecting off the crystal chandeliers and the 3-foot-tall ice sculpture of a stork that stood in the center of the seafood buffet. A live jazz band played soft, sophisticated tunes in the corner, filling the air with a rhythm that screamed money. It was exactly what they wanted. It was perfect. And it was completely hollow. I stood near the entrance greeting the guests as they arrived. The entire congregation of Mama Joyce's church filed in, their eyes wide with shock as they took in the opulence. They whispered behind their fans, wondering how the unemployed Jackson sister could afford a venue where a glass of water cost $10. I smiled and directed them to the open bar, playing the role of the gracious hostess while silently noting every witness who would testify later. Then came the guests of honor. Tanisha and Brad made their grand entrance 20 minutes late, designed for maximum impact. Tanisha waddled into the room in her gold sequin dress, which looked even tighter under the ballroom lights. She clung to Brad's arm, flashing a smile that was all teeth and gums. Brad, in his rented tuxedo, walked with a strut that bordered on comical. He waved to people he barely knew, acting like a senator at a fundraising gala. They stopped every few feet to accept compliments, soaking up the attention like dry sponges. "Look at us," Tanisha whispered loudly as she passed me. "This is where we belong, Jasmine. Top of the world." I just nodded, handing her a glass of sparkling cider. "You certainly made an impression," I said. She took the glass and immediately turned away to show off her ring to Mrs. Patterson. She did not notice that her 7 children were sitting at a table in the back corner, dressed in ill-fitting clothes, looking at the mountain of shrimp and lobster with hungry eyes. They had been told not to touch the food until the guests had eaten. The atmosphere shifted perceptibly when the double doors opened again. Harrison and Eleanor Wentworth walked in. The room seemed to get quieter. They moved with an easy old money grace that made Tanisha's sequins look cheap. Brad froze mid-laugh. He immediately abandoned Tanisha and rushed toward his parents, his arms wide open, desperation leaking from his pores. "Mom! Dad!" he boomed, his voice cracking slightly. "You made it. I am so glad you came to celebrate my success." Harrison Wentworth did not hug his son. He simply extended a hand and offered a firm, cold handshake. "We wouldn't miss it, Bradley," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "We wanted to see exactly what you have built for yourself." Eleanor offered a tight, thin smile and nodded at Tanisha, who was frantically trying to smooth out her dress. "It is certainly elaborate," she said, looking at the ice sculpture with mild distaste. Brad missed the insult entirely. He took it as a compliment. "Please sit at the head table," he insisted, ushering them toward the front. "We have so much to talk about. I have big plans." I watched from the shadows near the AV booth. The stage was fully set. The victims were hungry in the corner. The villains were feasting at the head table. And the executioners were sipping wine and waiting for my signal. I looked at the waiter and nodded. It was time to serve the first course. And time to start the show. The jazz band faded into a low hum as the sound of silverware striking crystal echoed through the ballroom. Brad stood up, swaying slightly. His face was flushed a deep red, not just from the heat of the spotlights, but from the 3 glasses of expensive bourbon he had downed in the last hour. He loosened his bow tie with one hand and gripped the microphone with the other, looking out at the sea of faces like an emperor surveying his dominion. He was drunk on alcohol, but he was even more intoxicated by the illusion of power. "Thank you, everyone," he boomed, his voice echoing a bit too loudly over the speakers, causing a few guests to wince. What a night. What a gathering. I want to take a moment to welcome my parents, Harrison and Eleanor Wentworth, who flew in all the way from Connecticut. He gestured toward them with a glass of champagne that was dangerously close to spilling. "Mom, Dad, I know we have had our differences. I know you didn't understand my vision when I left the corporate world. But I think looking around this room tonight, you can see that I made the right choice. I think you can see that the empire I am building here is real." Harrison Wentworth did not smile. He simply stared at his son with eyes like flint. Brad didn't notice. He was too busy believing his own lies. "You know, being the head of a household this size is not easy," he continued, puffing out his chest. "Tanisha carries the babies, but I carry the weight of the world. The financial planning, the investments, the real estate deals. It takes a strong man to steer a ship this big through the storm of the economy. And I have done it. I have kept a roof over our heads and food on our table through sheer grit and artistic genius." A ripple of confused whispering moved through the room. The church members knew Tanisha was always borrowing money. The neighbors knew about the repo man. But Brad plowed on, oblivious. "And I want to give a special shout out to my sister-in-law, Jasmine. Stand up, Jazz. Don't be shy." I stood up slowly, my face a mask of polite neutrality. The spotlight swung over to me, blinding me for a second. Brad grinned, a sloppy, wet smile. "You know, folks, every king needs a court jester. I am kidding. I am kidding. Seriously, though, Jasmine has been a great little helper. She is the one who handles the small stuff. You know, buying the diapers, picking up the milk when I am too busy closing deals at the studio. She is like our glorified babysitter, and we love her for it." He laughed at his own joke, waiting for the audience to join in. A few of Tanisha's friends giggled nervously, but the rest of the room was dead silent. Brad didn't care. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And hey, maybe if she took a page out of Tanisha's book and learned how to treat a man, she wouldn't have to spend every Friday night alone with her cats. Maybe she would have a husband instead of just renting ours." The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud. It was cruel, it was public, and it was exactly what I needed him to say. He had just confirmed to everyone in the room that he viewed me not as a savior, but as a servant. He viewed my generosity as weakness. Tanisha cackled loudly, clapping her hands, delighting in my humiliation. Brad raised his glass high, spilling champagne onto the cuff of his rented tuxedo. So here is to the future, to the new house we are buying next week, to the new baby, and to me for making it all happen. Cheers. He downed the drink in one gulp and slammed the glass onto the table. The applause was scattered and polite, mostly coming from people who just wanted the awkwardness to end. I sat down slowly. My hands were folded in my lap. I looked at the AV technician across the room. He was watching me, his finger hovering over the enter key. I gave him a barely perceptible nod. Brad had his speech. Now it was my turn. The applause for Brad's speech died down quickly, replaced by the clinking of silverware and the low murmur of confused gossip. I stood up again, taking the microphone from the stand. My hand was steady, my pulse calm. I looked at Brad, who was refilling his glass, and at Tanisha, who was busy checking her reflection in a spoon. They looked so comfortable. So safe. "Thank you, Brad," I said, my voice projecting clear and sharp across the ballroom. "That was truly a speech I will never forget. You are right. I have been a helper. I have worked in the shadows for a long time. But tonight, I wanted to step into the light. I wanted to give you a gift that honors where you came from. You always talk about how much you miss your old apartment, how unfair the eviction was, how the landlord was a tyrant who threw a pregnant woman onto the street." Tanisha nodded vigorously, dabbing at a fake tear. "He was a monster," she cried out for the benefit of the room. "He hates children." I smiled. "Well, I thought it was time we cleared the air, so I invited him here to tell his side of the story. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Frank Russo." The room went deadly silent. I pointed to the double doors at the back of the room. The spotlight operator, who I had tipped $100 earlier, swung the beam of light away from the head table and hit the doors just as they swung open. Mr. Russo walked in. He was not dressed for a gala. He was wearing a windbreaker and work boots, and he looked furious. Beside him walked a man in a sharp gray suit, carrying a thick stack of documents. Brad dropped his fork. It hit the china plate with a loud crack that echoed like a gunshot. Tanisha grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his tuxedo jacket. "What is this?" she hissed. "What is he doing here?" Mr. Russo marched right up to the edge of the dance floor. He did not need a microphone. His voice was loud enough to reach the back row. "I am not here to eat your shrimp," he shouted, pointing a calloused finger at the head table. "I am here to collect what is mine. You two are standing there playing rich, while you owe me $40,000 in damages." A collective gasp ripped through the room. Mama Joyce stood up, clutching her pearls. "Sir, you cannot come in here and make accusations," she stammered. "My son-in-law is a respectable artist." Mr. Russo laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Artist? Lady, your son-in-law is a con artist." He turned to the crowd, addressing the church members and the neighbors directly. "They told you I evicted them because they were poor, right? They told you I threw them out because they couldn't pay rent. That is a lie. I evicted them because for 6 months they were not living there. They were subletting my property to 3 college students for cash under the table." He motioned to the lawyer beside him, who stepped forward and placed the stack of papers onto the head table right next to the lobster tower. "This is a lawsuit for breach of contract fraud and extensive property destruction," Mr. Russo continued. "You took cash from those students and you let them destroy my unit. Holes in the drywall, cigarette burns on this carpet, mold in the bathroom. You pocketed the money to buy those fake shoes while you let my investment rot. And now you are going to pay for every cent of it." Brad stood up, his face turning from red to a pale, sickly white. "Now hold on, Frank," he stammered, trying to block his parents from seeing the papers. "We can talk about this. This is a misunderstanding. I was going to pay you." "You are served," the lawyer said, simply cutting him off. "You have 30 days to respond, or we move for a default judgment." Tanisha jumped up, knocking over her water glass. "You are a liar," she screamed, her voice shrill and panicked. Jasmine put you up to this. She paid you to lie. Get out! Security, get him out! But the security guards did not move. I had instructed them to stand down. I watched Tanisha unzip her facade in real time. The guests were whispering frantically now. The image of the struggling parents was shattering. They weren't evicted because of hardship. They were evicted for greed. Mr. Russo looked at me and nodded once, a gesture of grim respect. Then he turned and walked out, leaving the lawsuit sitting on the table like a bomb that had just detonated. Brad stared at the papers, his hands shaking. Harrison Wentworth picked up the top document and began to read, his face hardening into stone. I leaned into the microphone again. Well, that was unexpected, I said, my voice dripping with false sympathy. But Tanisha, you said you wanted the truth to come out tonight, and we are just getting started. Kevin hit the lights. The room plunged into darkness. The only light came from the massive LED screen behind me, which suddenly flickered to life. The appetizer was over. It was time for the main course. The massive LED screen flickered to life, bathing the darkened ballroom in a soft, sentimental blue glow. A giant high-definition image of a sonogram appeared. It was the baby Tanisha was currently carrying. A collective awe rippled through the crowd. Tanisha wiped her eyes, smiling at the image, believing that despite the interruption with the landlord, I was finally giving her the tribute she deserved. The slide changed to a photo of the 7 children standing in the front yard. They looked small and ragged, but the lighting made them look angelic. Then the music cut out. It did not fade. It stopped abruptly with a jarring scratch. The screen glitched for a fraction of a second before the sentimental images were replaced by something stark and clinical. A spreadsheet. It was blown up to 20 feet tall, so even the people in the back row could read the fine print. The header read, Monthly Cash Flow Analysis. I stepped back into the spotlight, my voice cutting through the confused silence. Tanisha likes to tell everyone that it takes a village to raise a child. And she is right. This village, the church, the neighbors, the state, you have all contributed to the Jackson Family Fund, but I think you deserve to know where your investment is actually going. I clicked the remote. The spreadsheet highlighted a row in bright yellow. Date, the 1st of the month. Description, State Assistance for Minors. Credit, $4,200. That is the money the government sends to feed these 7 children, I explained, pointing at the screen. It is deposited at 9 in the morning. Now look at the next line. I clicked again. A row in bright red appeared underneath it. Timestamp, 9:15 in the morning. Description, transfer to DraftKings Sportsbook. Debit, $4,000. The room gasped. It was a physical sound, like the air being sucked out of the space. Tanisha's mouth fell open. Brad scrambled out of his chair, knocking it over. Turn it off, he screamed, waving his arms frantically at the AV booth. This is illegal. You cannot show my private banking records. Turn it off now. I ignored him. Kevin, the technician, ignored him. I clicked the remote again. A new document appeared. This one was a tuition invoice from the private school where the 3 eldest children were supposed to be enrolled. 2 months ago, the church held a special collection, I said, looking directly at Mrs. Patterson, who was sitting near the front. You raised $3,000 to pay for Marcus's tuition because Brad said he was being kicked out for lack of payment. You gave that money in cash. I clicked the button. A copy of a receipt appeared on the screen. It was from Best Buy. The date was the day after the church collection. The items listed were a PlayStation 5, a 70-inch 4K television, and $300 worth of virtual currency for a video game. Mrs. Patterson stood up, her face purple with rage. She pointed a trembling finger at Brad. You told me Marcus needed books, she shouted, her voice shaking the rafters. You told me he was crying because he could not go to class. I gave you my pension money, Bradley. Brad looked around the room, sweat pouring down his face. He held up his hands. It was an investment. He stammered, trying to shout over the growing murmur of the crowd. I stream my games online. People make millions doing it. I was buying equipment to start a business to pay you all back. I laughed, a cold sound amplified by the speakers. A business. Let us look at the returns on your business, Brad. I clicked the final slide of this segment. It was a graph showing his win-loss ratio on the betting app. It was a steep red line plunging straight down. Net loss, year to date, $21,000. You are not an entrepreneur, Brad. I said, my voice hard as iron. You are a thief. You stole the food out of your children's mouths. You stole the retirement money from these old ladies. And you took the state benefits meant for shoes and coats and bet them on football games you lost. Harrison Wentworth stood up slowly at the head table. He was looking at the screen with an expression of absolute horror. He turned to his son. You gambled the welfare checks, he asked, his voice quiet but terrifying. You are on government assistance and you gambled it away. Brad reached out to grab his father's arm, but Harrison recoiled, as if he had been touched by something filthy. Don't you touch me, Harrison snarled. Tanisha tried to intervene. It is a lie, she shrieked, looking at the crowd. Jasmine photoshopped those numbers. She is trying to frame us. I looked at Tanisha with pity. The numbers do not lie, Tanisha. But if you think that is bad, wait until you see where the rent money went. Kevin, next slide. The silence in the ballroom was different now. Before it was the silence of shock, but now it was the silence of anticipation. The spreadsheet on the giant screen faded to black, leaving the room in total darkness for a heartbeat. Then a single thin green line appeared horizontally across the LED wall. It was a digital audio waveform. It sat there static and ominous like the flat line on a heart monitor. I lowered the microphone slightly, looking directly at Tanisha. She was still standing near the head table, clutching her purse, her chest heaving with a mix of rage and denial. She wanted to believe the numbers were fake. She wanted to believe I was the villain. But I had one last piece of evidence that could not be photoshopped. I had the truth from Brad's own lips. You can argue with spreadsheets, Tanisha, I said softly, my voice echoing through the hushed room. You can claim the bank made a mistake. You can claim I forged the documents. But you cannot argue with this. I hired a private investigator, Tanisha. And in the state of Georgia, only one party needs to consent to a recording. Brad didn't know he was being recorded when he met his friend for drinks last Tuesday, but my investigator was sitting right at the next table. I nodded to Kevin. Play it. The green line on the screen jumped to life, spiking jaggedly in time with the sound of clinking beer bottles and background chatter. Then Brad's voice filled the room. It was not the polished voice he used for his speech. It was slurred, arrogant, and unguarded. Man, you gotta stop worrying about the bills, Brad's voice boomed. The clarity was terrifying. It sounded like he was standing right next to Tanisha. The gravy train isn't going to stop. Tanisha is pregnant again. A second voice, the investigator's contact, laughed. Again. Bro, do you even like kids? Brad's voice scoffed. Hell no. They are loud and they smell. But every time she pops one out, her sister writes a check. Jasmine is so obsessed with being the savior she will pay for anything as long as there is a baby involved. It is the perfect hustle. I keep Tanisha barefoot and pregnant, and Jasmine pays the mortgage. It is passive income, baby. Tanisha froze. Her hands went to her stomach instinctively. The color drained from her face, leaving her ashen beneath her heavy makeup. Brad lunged toward the AV booth again, knocking over a chair. Stop it! He screamed, his voice cracking with panic. That is a deepfake! That is AI! She made it up. But the recording continued louder and crueler. But what about Tanisha? The other voice asked. Doesn't she get suspicious? Brad laughed, a sound that was pure malice. Tanisha. Please. That girl is dumb as a box of rocks. I tell her she is a queen and she believes it. I tell her I am an art investor and she believes it. She is desperate for a man to validate her. I married her because her sister is rich, not because she is a prize. Honestly, if the checks stop coming, I am out. I can't stand her voice anyway. The waveform flatlined. The recording ended. For 10 seconds, nobody breathed. The cruelty of the words hung in the air, suffocating the room. Brad stood frozen near the stage, his eyes darting around, searching for an exit, searching for a lie that could cover this. But there was no lie big enough. He had just called his wife stupid and admitted to using her body as a financial tool in front of her mother, her pastor, and his own parents. I watched Tanisha. She did not scream, she did not attack him, she looked like she had been shot. She turned slowly to look at Brad. The arrogance was gone from her face, replaced by a hollow, devastating realization. The man she had defended against me, against our mother, against the world for 10 years, had just confirmed her deepest, darkest fear. That she was unlovable. That she was just a means to an end. "You said I was smart?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You told me I was the only one who understood your vision." Brad reached out, his hands shaking. "Baby, listen to me. That was just locker room talk. I was drunk. I didn't mean it. I was just trying to impress the guys." Harrison Wentworth stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He walked over to his son and looked him up and down with absolute disgust. "You are not a man," he said, his voice cutting like a razor. "You are a predator, and you are a disgrace to my name." Tanisha looked at me. Her eyes were wide and filled with tears, but for the first time in years, they weren't looking at me with jealousy. They were looking at me with shame. She realized that while she was playing dress-up in a sequin gown, I was the only person in the room who actually cared enough to tell her the truth. The illusion was gone. And all that was left was the wreckage. The echo of Brad's voice from the recording seemed to linger in the air like a foul odor. He looked around the room, his eyes wide and frantic, seeking an ally, but finding only disgust. He turned toward his mother, expecting the unconditional coddling he received from Tanisha, but Eleanor Wentworth was not Tanisha. She moved across the dance floor with a terrifying grace, her face set in a mask of icy rage. Brad opened his mouth, likely to utter another lie or a plea for money, but he never got the chance. Eleanor pulled her hand back and struck him. The sound of her palm connecting with his cheek was sharp and violent, cracking through the silence of the ballroom like a whip. Brad stumbled back, clutching his face in genuine shock. He had never been disciplined in his life, and to receive it now in front of 200 people was a humiliation that shattered his fragile ego instantly. "You are vile!" Eleanor spat, her voice trembling not with sorrow, but with fury. "We sent you money because you said the baby needed surgery. We sent you checks because you said your studio flooded. You told us you were building a legacy, but you were just building a cage for these children and laughing about it. You are not just a liar, Bradley. You are a thief. And you are a disappointment that I can no longer bear." Harrison stepped up beside his wife, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. He looked at his son with the cold detachment of a CEO firing an embezzling employee. "Do not look at us for help," Harrison said, his voice carrying to the back of the room. "We are done. Effective immediately, you are cut off from the trust. You are cut off from the estate. And do not think for a second that we will pay for your legal defense. In fact, I am going to make sure Jasmine has access to our family attorneys to ensure you are prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. We are not funding your defense, son. We are funding your prosecution." Brad looked as if he had been punched in the gut. His safety net had not just been removed, it had been set on fire. He turned to Tanisha, but she was staring at the floor, her arms wrapped around her stomach as if trying to physically hold herself together. Suddenly, Mama Joyce rushed forward from her table, pushing past the stunned guests. She looked frantic, her carefully constructed image of the perfect matriarch crumbling around her. "Stop this!" she cried, waving her hands at the Wentworths. "Everyone, please calm down. Calm. This is a family matter. We do not need to air our dirty laundry in front of the church. We can go to the back and pray on this. We can find a path to forgiveness. Brad made a mistake, but he is still the father of these children." She turned to the crowd, forcing a strained smile. "You all know how the devil tests us. We cannot let money divide a family." But the room did not murmur in agreement as they usually did. There was no chorus of amen. Instead, Mrs. Patterson, the head of the church choir, stood up. She was a woman who had sat next to Mama Joyce in the pews for 30 years. She looked at Joyce with a mixture of pity and betrayal. "Sit down, Joyce," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice heavy with judgment. "You stood there, and watched us put cash in the collection plate for that boy. You told us they were starving. You told us Tanisha was being persecuted. And you knew. You knew he was gambling it away. You knew he was stealing from your own daughter. Mama Joyce stammered, her eyes darting around the room. I didn't know the extent. I just wanted to keep the peace. There is no peace in a lie, Mrs. Patterson shot back. You enabled a thief because you wanted to look good. You sacrificed Jasmine to protect a man who just called your other daughter a box of rocks. You should be ashamed of yourself. The crowd erupted in murmurs of agreement. The shame that Mama Joyce had tried to weaponize against me for my entire life was finally being turned back on her. She looked at the faces of her friends and saw only rejection. She shrank back, sinking into her chair, defeated. The shield of the church was gone. Brad was alone. Joyce was alone. And for the first time, Tanisha was looking at the wreckage, not as a victim of circumstance, but as a victim of her own choices. I stood by the AV booth and watched the house of cards fall. It was time for the final blow. I signaled the police officers who were waiting in the wings. The party was over. The heavy oak doors of the St. Regis ballroom swung open with a violence that shattered the last remnants of the party's atmosphere. This time it was not a surprise guest or a disgruntled landlord. 4 uniformed police officers marched into the room, followed closely by 2 detectives in plain clothes. The warm, ambient lighting of the chandeliers was suddenly sliced through by the harsh, rhythmic flashing of blue and red lights from the patrol cars parked just outside the terrace doors. The festive illusion was gone, replaced instantly by the cold reality of a crime scene. The music cut out completely. The jazz band lowered their instruments, their eyes wide. The room went silent, except for the heavy thud of police boots on the parquet floor and the hysterical sobbing of Tanisha, who was still clutching her stomach near the head table. The officers did not look around. They knew exactly who they were coming for. They moved with a terrifying efficiency straight toward the head table where Brad was trying to wipe the sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. One of the detectives, a tall man with a badge clipped to his belt, stepped into the spotlight. Bradley Thomas Wentworth, he announced, his voice booming without the need for a microphone. You are under arrest. Brad stumbled back, knocking over a crystal water pitcher that shattered on the floor. For what, he squeaked, his voice cracking. This is a private event. You can't be here. My father is Harrison Wentworth. He pointed desperately at his father. Dad, tell them. Tell them who we are. Harrison Wentworth did not even turn his head. He stared straight ahead, sipping his water as if his son did not exist. The detective ignored the outburst and pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. We have a warrant for your arrest on multiple counts of federal identity theft, wire fraud, and grand larceny. We also have a signed confession of judgment acknowledging these debts and crimes which you provided to the victim less than an hour ago. Brad's eyes locked onto me. He realized then what the gift receipt had been. You tricked me, he screamed, lunging forward before the officers grabbed his arms and slammed him against the table. She tricked me. That signature doesn't count. It counts, Brad, I said calmly, standing near the police line. You signed it in front of 200 witnesses. You confessed to opening credit cards in my name. You confessed to stealing my identity. And now you are going to prison for it. The officers wrenched Brad's arms behind his back, and the sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed through the silent room. He began to weep loud, ugly sobs that sounded more like a child throwing a tantrum than a man facing justice. But the police were not done. The second detective turned toward Tanisha. Tanisha Jackson, he said, please place your hands behind your back. Tanisha froze, her eyes bulging. Me, I didn't do anything. I am pregnant. You can't arrest a pregnant woman. It was all him. He did the gambling. I just signed what he told me to sign. Ignorance is not a defense for conspiracy, ma'am, the detective replied, stepping closer. You are listed as a co-signer on the fraudulent accounts. Furthermore, we have probable cause to detain you for child neglect and endangerment based on the evidence presented tonight regarding the misuse of state funds intended for your children. Tanisha shrieked a sound so piercing that several guests covered their ears. My babies! You are trying to take my babies! Jasmine, stop them! Tell them I am a good mother. I looked at her, at the sequin dress that cost more than Marcus's tuition, and I felt nothing but a deep, weary sadness. I can't do that, Tanisha, I said softly. Because a good mother feeds her children before she buys lobster. A good mother doesn't let her husband gamble away the heating bill. From the side of the room, Mrs. Gable and her team from Child Protective Services moved in. They were gentle but firm, guiding the 7 confused and frightened children away from the scene. Marcus looked back at me, his eyes wide with fear. I nodded to him, mouthing the words, "It will be okay." He didn't smile, but he stopped fighting, allowing the social worker to lead him out the side door, away from the spectacle of his parents in cuffs. The officers marched Brad and Tanisha out through the center of the ballroom. The guests, the church members, the neighbors parted like the Red Sea, creating a path of shame. Brad hung his head defeated, but Tanisha kept screaming, blaming everyone but herself, until the doors finally closed behind them. The flashing lights faded, leaving the room in a stunned silence. The party was over. The cleanup was just beginning. The officers paused near the exit, allowing Tanisha one final moment of dignity that she did not deserve. The ballroom was silent, save for the heavy breathing of the crowd who watched the scene unfold with a mixture of horror and fascination. Tanisha's face was a ruin. The waterproof mascara she had applied so carefully hours ago was now streaking down her cheeks in thick black rivulets, making her look like a tragic clown. The sequins on her dress, which had sparkled so defiantly earlier, now looked cheap and garish under the harsh glare of the emergency lights. She stopped struggling against the officer's grip and locked eyes with me. For the first time in her life, the arrogance was completely gone. There was no smugness, no superiority, no belief that she was the golden child who could do no wrong. There was only raw, animalistic fear. She realized that Mama Joyce could not pray this away. She realized that Brad could not lie his way out of this. She was alone, and I was the only person holding the key to her salvation. Jasmine, she wailed, her voice cracking into a desperate sob, please, you cannot let them take me. I am your baby sister. We grew up in the same room. We have the same blood running through our veins. Look at me, Jasmine. I am pregnant. You are going to let your niece or nephew be born in a prison cell. How can you be so cruel? She lunged forward, the handcuffs clinking sharply behind her back. I didn't mean to hurt you. I just wanted us to have a good life. I wanted us to be happy like you. Is that a crime? Is wanting the best for your family a crime? Just tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them you gave us permission to use your name. Please, Jasmine, do it for Mama. Do it for the family. I looked at her, at the sister I had protected for 30 years. I remembered sharing toys with her. I remembered braiding her hair. But then I remembered the eviction notice. I remembered Marcus's taped shoes. I remembered the $85,000 of debt she had strapped to my back without a second thought. She was using our shared history as a weapon. She was trying to cash in on a bond that she had already bankrupt. I stepped closer to her until I was only inches away. The guests held their breath, expecting me to crack, expecting the dutiful older sister to emerge and save the day one last time. But that woman was dead. She died the moment I saw that gambling debt. I looked Tanisha dead in the eye. You keep talking about family, I said, my voice low and steady. You keep talking about blood, like it is some kind of magic shield. But family does not steal your identity, Tanisha. Family does not let you drown in debt so they can eat lobster. Family does not starve their children to buy video games. You are not my sister right now. You are an accomplice to a felony. Tanisha sobbed louder, shaking her head violently. But we are blood, she screamed. You can't turn your back on blood. I leaned in closer so only she could hear the final verdict. Blood is biology, Tanisha. It is just DNA. It is not a free pass to commit crimes. It is not a license to abuse the people who love you. You broke the contract of sisterhood a long time ago. You chose Brad. You chose the lies. You chose the greed. And now you have to choose the consequences. I signaled to the officer. Take her away. Tanisha let out a primal scream as the officers began to drag her toward the revolving doors. She kicked and thrashed, her sequined dress bunching up around her legs, but it was useless. As she was hauled out into the night, screaming my name one last time, I did not look away. I watched until the doors stopped spinning. I felt a single tear roll down my cheek, but it wasn't for her. It was for the sister I wished I had, the one who didn't exist. I turned back to the room where the stunned silence was finally breaking into whispers. I was alone. My credit was ruined. My family was shattered. But for the first time in years, I was free. The family court hearing took place 3 days after the party in a room that smelled of furniture polish and stale anxiety. The atmosphere was sterile and suffocatingly quiet. There were no crystal chandeliers here and no jazz band to mask the tension. I stood alone at the plaintiff's table. To my left, the 2 chairs designated for the parents were empty. Brad and Tanisha were currently being held at the county detention center denied bail due to the severity of the federal fraud charges and the flight risk Brad posed given his family connections. Judge Vance sat behind the high bench looking down at me over the rim of her spectacles. She was a woman who had seen the worst of humanity, and she did not look impressed by my resume or my tailored suit. She flipped through the thick file on her desk, the sound of the turning pages echoing like gunshots in the silence. "Ms. Jackson," she began, her voice dry and authoritative, "the report from Child Protective Services is damning. The malnutrition, the educational neglect, the exploitation of state funds. It is a horror show. However, I must look at the practicalities. You are a single woman with a demanding career. You are asking for custody of 7 traumatized children plus an infant that will be born in state custody within the month. That is not a family, Ms. Jackson. That is a platoon. Why should I believe you can handle a burden that broke 2 parents?" I stood up straighter, clutching the edge of the table to steady my shaking hands. I had rehearsed this answer 1,000 times in the mirror. "Your Honor. Those 2 parents were not broken by the burden of raising children. They were broken by their own greed. They viewed these children as financial instruments, as leverage to get sympathy and money. I view them as human beings." I took a breath and continued. "I have already secured a leave of absence from my clinic to stabilize the transition. I have hired 2 full-time nannies who specialize in trauma-informed care. I have converted my guest wing into a dormitory, and I have enrolled the 3 eldest in therapy starting next week. I am not asking to just house them, I am asking to heal them. I have the resources, but more importantly, I have the will. I am the only one left who does not see them as a paycheck." Judge Vance studied me for a long, agonizing minute. Then she nodded slowly. She picked up her gavel. "Based on the compelling evidence of endangerment by the biological parents and the comprehensive care plan presented by the aunt, I am granting temporary sole guardianship of all minor children to Jasmine Jackson. This order is effective immediately." She brought the gavel down with a sharp crack that sounded like the starting gun for the rest of my life. I walked out of the courtroom feeling lightheaded. In the sterile hallway, Harrison and Eleanor Wentworth were waiting. They looked like ghosts. The arrogant armor they wore at the party had vanished, leaving behind 2 old, tired people. Harrison stepped forward. He did not offer a handshake. Instead, he extended a thick manila envelope. "We established an irrevocable trust this morning," Harrison said, his voice devoid of emotion. "It covers tuition, health care, and living expenses for all 7 children until they reach the age of 25. You are the sole trustee. We will not contest the custody arrangement." I took the envelope. It felt heavy. "Don't you want to see them?" I asked quietly. "Marcus asks about you. He remembers the toy train you sent him once." Eleanor turned away, looking out the window at the gray city skyline. "No," she whispered. "We failed Bradley. We raised a predator because we were too busy being rich to be parents. We are not going to inflict our influence on these children. We are cutting the rot out of the family tree, Jasmine. You are the gardener now. Take the money." Give them the life we couldn't give our own son. They turned and walked toward the elevators, their footsteps clicking rhythmically on the linoleum floor. They were wealthy, powerful, and completely alone. They had chosen to pay for their penance rather than participate in it. I watched the elevator doors close, swallowing them whole. I looked down at the envelope in my hand. It was enough money to save the children, but money couldn't fix what was broken. That part was up to me. I walked toward the exit, ready to go pick up my kids. The fluorescent lights of the county jail visitation room buzzed with a headache-inducing frequency. Tanisha sat on one side of the thick reinforced glass, her orange jumpsuit hanging loosely on her frame except for the tight mound of her belly. On the other side sat Brad. He looked pathetic. His hair was greasy, his designer stubble had grown into a patchy beard, and his eyes were darting around nervously. He picked up the phone receiver, not to ask how she was, but to scream. "It is your fault," he hissed, his voice tinny through the speaker. "If you hadn't demanded that stupid party, none of this would have happened. You wanted the lobster. You wanted the dress. I told you to keep a low profile, but you had to show off. Now my parents aren't picking up the phone, and the public defender says I am looking at 5 years minimum. You ruined my life, Tanisha." Tanisha stared at him. For 10 years she had treated his word like gospel. She had starved her children to buy him paints he never used. She had fought with her sister to defend his honor. And here he was when the walls were closing in, throwing her to the wolves to save his own skin. The love she thought existed was just a transaction, and she was the one paying the bill. "I ruined your life," she whispered into the phone, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Brad, I gave you my life, and you spent it like loose change." 2 weeks later, the reality of her choices hit her with the force of a freight train. She went into labor in the middle of the night. There was no birthing suite at the St. Regis. There was no soothing music or epidural on demand. There was only the sterile, cold prison infirmary and a guard standing by the door looking bored. Tanisha screamed in pain and loneliness, gripping the metal rails of the bed. She wanted her mother. She wanted Jasmine. But she had burned those bridges to the ground. When the baby boy was finally born, he cried a strong, healthy sound that echoed off the concrete walls. The nurse cleaned him up and wrapped him in a rough institutional blanket. Tanisha reached out her arms, aching to hold him, to smell him, to promise him she would do better. But the nurse pulled away. "I am sorry, Ms. Jackson," the nurse said, her voice kind but firm. "You know the protocol. The baby is in state custody." The door opened and I walked in. I was wearing a soft coat and carrying a car seat. I felt like an intruder in this place of misery, but I had a job to do. I walked over to the nurse and presented the court order granting me immediate guardianship. The nurse nodded and placed the newborn into my arms. He felt warm and solid, a tiny life that had no idea of the chaos he had been born into. Tanisha watched from the bed, her body empty and her heart shattering. "He is beautiful, Jasmine," she choked out, reaching a hand toward us but stopping short. "Please, tell him I loved him." I looked down at the sleeping infant and then back at my sister. "I will tell him the truth, Tanisha," I said quietly. "I will tell him that you made a mistake, and I will make sure he never pays for it." I turned and walked out of the room, taking the last piece of Tanisha's soul with me. The door clicked shut, and Tanisha was left alone with nothing but the hum of the lights and the ghosts of her own decisions. My penthouse, once a museum of modern art and silence, had been transformed into a high-end, chaotic train station, but I wouldn't trade the noise for anything in the world. 6 a.m. was no longer signaled by a polite chime on my phone, but by the thundering of small feet on hardwood floors, and the smell of maple syrup battling with the scent of baby formula. I walked into the kitchen, my eyes stinging from lack of sleep, and stopped to drink in the sight. 7 children sat around my marble island. There were no hollow cheeks. There was no hoarding of bread rolls in pockets. They were eating with the casual confidence of people who knew there would be lunch and dinner and breakfast again tomorrow. Later that afternoon, I managed to slip away from the clinic early to make it to the middle school gym. The squeak of sneakers on polished wood was deafening, but my eyes were locked on number 23. Marcus. He moved across the court with a fluidity I had never seen before. He was wearing the new Jordans I had bought him, not to sit in a box as a trophy, but to be worn out on the court. He wasn't gasping for air after a few sprints anymore because his body was finally fueled by protein instead of stress. When he sank a three-pointer, he didn't look at the coach. He looked at me in the bleachers. The smile he gave me was blinding. It was the smile of a boy who had finally put down the weight of the world. But this new life wasn't a fairy tale. It was a grind. There were nights when Tanisha's newborn screamed for hours inconsolable, without his mother's scent, leaving me pacing the floor until dawn. There were therapy sessions where the older kids broke down terrified that the police were coming back to take me away too. I was exhausted. My social life was dead. My bank account was draining faster than I could replenish it. Yet every time I looked at their filling faces, I knew I was building something real. However, building a fortress meant guarding the gate. On Sunday, the doorman called to tell me Mama Joyce was in the lobby. She had brought her famous peach cobbler, a sugary Trojan horse she used to smooth over every family sin. I went down to meet her, but I didn't invite her up. She stood near the fountain, clutching the Tupperware, looking small and fragile in her Sunday hat. She started immediately talking about forgiveness, about how the Bible says to honor thy family, about how she just wanted to hug her grandbabies. I stood my ground, my arms crossed, feeling like a riot shield. I told her the truth that no one else would. I told her that she had sat at a table full of food while her grandchildren were starving a few miles away. I told her that she had prioritized her image over their survival. She tried to cry, tried to guilt me, but I was immune. I told her that until she could admit that Tanisha was a criminal and not a victim, she was a danger to their recovery. I watched her leave, walking out the glass doors with her cobbler still in hand. It hurt to cut her off, but looking at the elevator that led back to my noisy, happy, safe home, I knew I wasn't losing a mother. I was finally becoming one. The penthouse is finally quiet, but it is not the hollow, echoing silence that used to greet me when I came home from the clinic. It is a warm, heavy silence, the kind that settles in after a long day of noise and chaos and life. I walk over to the sidebar and pour myself a glass of Cabernet. My hand brushes against a coloring book left on the counter. I smile. A month ago, that would have annoyed me. A month ago, I would have scrubbed the counter until it gleamed. Now, I just move the book to the side and leave it there. I sit down on the beige velvet sofa, the same spot where this story started. But I am not the same woman who sat here back then. That Jasmine was a doormat wrapped in designer silk. That Jasmine thought love was a transaction. She thought that if she just gave enough, paid enough, and sacrificed enough, eventually her family would love her back. She was wrong. She was buying affection from people who were selling her out. I take a sip of the wine, letting the rich, dark liquid coat my tongue. I think about Tanisha sitting in her cell, staring at concrete walls, probably still telling herself she is the victim. I think about Brad blaming everyone but the man in the mirror. I think about Mama Joyce sitting alone in her house, clutching her Bible, and wondering why her prayers didn't fix this. They are all miserable. And for the first time in my life, I do not feel the urge to fix it for them. People love to throw around the word family. They wield it like a weapon. They use it to guilt you into submission. They tell you that you cannot turn your back on blood. They tell you that loyalty is absolute no matter how toxic the water in the well becomes. But I learned the hard way that biology is the least important part of the equation. Sharing DNA is just a biological accident. It doesn't make you family. It just makes you related. I look up toward the ceiling, toward the bedrooms where 8 children are sleeping safely for the first time in their lives. They are not my children by birth. I did not carry them. I did not labor for them. But I fought for them. I stood in the line of fire for them when their own parents were using them as shields. And I saved them. Real family isn't the people who drain you dry and then ask for a refill. Real family isn't the people who use your success to cover their failures. Real family are the people who protect you. They are the ones who want you to win without asking for a cut of the prize. They are the ones who make you feel safe, not used. I swirl the wine in the glass, watching the red vortex spin. I lost a sister. I lost a mother. I lost a brother-in-law. To the outside world, it looks like a tragedy. But sitting here tonight, surrounded by the messy, beautiful evidence of the lives I am rebuilding, I know the truth. It wasn't a loss. It was an amputation. I cut off the dead weight so the rest of us could survive. I finished the glass and set it down on the table next to a stray Lego block. The war is over. The parasites are gone. And for the first time in 30 years, the house is clean. Not because the floors are polished, but because the lies are gone. This is what happiness feels like. It feels like freedom. Jasmine's journey teaches us a brutal but necessary truth. Family is defined by behavior, not biology. We often tolerate toxicity, financial abuse, and manipulation under the guise of loyalty. But enabling a predator is never an act of love. True family protects you. They don't drain you dry. Jasmine showed that setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's survival. By cutting off the rot, she didn't destroy her family, she saved the innocent lives that actually mattered. Sometimes you must be the villain in someone else's distorted narrative to be the hero in your own reality. If you've ever had to draw a hard line to protect your peace, hit that subscribe button and share your story in the comments below.